Commander Zekthor stood on the bridge of his warship and watched the small vessel drift through space like a wounded animal. The ship was damaged and its engines flickered with weak light that told him it would not last much longer without help. His crew had been tracking this unauthorized vessel for 3 full cycles, and it had ignored every single one of their warning messages. The ship had crossed into restricted territory without clearance and without any identification codes that the Galactic Enforcement Coalition would recognize. Zekthor was a commander who followed the rules, and the rules were very clear about what happened to ships that ignored warnings and entered forbidden space. His tactical officer turned toward him with all weapons ready and waiting for the command. Zekthor did not hesitate because hesitation got people killed in his line of work. He gave the order to fire and watched as bright streams of plasma energy shot across the darkness toward the small damaged ship. The weapons hit their target, and Zekthor expected to see the ship break apart, like all the others that had made the same mistake. But something impossible happened right before his eyes. The primitive ship had shields that should have collapsed under the first hit, but they did not collapse. The shields held firm, and then they began to change color and adapt to the weapons fire in a way that no known technology in the entire galaxy could achieve. The shields shimmered with colors that hurt to look at, and the plasma rounds that should have destroyed the ship simply melted away against the barrier. Every alarm on the bridge started screaming at once, and Zekthor felt his 3 hearts begin to race with a fear he had not known since he was young. His communication officer shouted that their systems were being overridden by something from the damaged ship. Then a single word appeared on every screen in the bridge and broadcast on every frequency that existed. The word appeared in the language of every species on his crew, and it burned itself into their minds with a weight that felt like a physical force pressing down on their souls. The word was simple and short, but it carried meaning that made experienced warriors feel like children again. The word was Earth. Zekthor had heard stories about Earth when he was training at the military academy, but he had thought they were just legends told to scare young officers. Every species in the galaxy knew the name, even if they pretended they did not. Earth was the name of a world that had been locked away behind barriers of twisted space and time, because the beings that lived there were too dangerous to let loose among the stars. The stories said that humans were a species that made war as naturally as others breathed, and that they had nearly destroyed themselves a dozen times before they even learned to leave their own planet. The Council had found them thousands of years ago and decided that the only safe choice was to seal them away and hope they would destroy themselves before they figured out how to break free. Zekthor ordered his crew to stop firing immediately, and his weapons officer obeyed so quickly that the commander knew he was not the only one who recognized the name. The entire fleet of 37 warships pulled back to a safe distance and held position, while their commanders tried to figure out what to do next. Zekthor opened a channel to his admiral and waited for orders that he hoped would tell him this was all some kind of mistake or false alarm. He did not want to be the commander who started a war with humanity, because every story he had ever heard said that was a war nobody would win. Inside the damaged vessel called Discovery, Captain Jake Morrison wiped blood from a cut on his forehead and allowed himself a tired smile. His ship had taken heavy damage and several of his crew were injured, but they were alive, and that was more than he had expected when the alien fleet opened fire without warning. Morrison had been in the service for 20 years and he had seen combat before, but this was his first time meeting other species from beyond Earth, and he had hoped it would go better than this. His communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Parker, looked up from her station with wide eyes and reported that the alien fleet was backing away from them. Morrison nodded, because that was exactly what he had expected would happen once the aliens figured out who they had just attacked. The Discovery was a small exploration vessel with a crew of only 40 people, and it had left Earth 6 months ago as part of humanity's first push into the wider galaxy. Morrison and his crew had strict orders about what to do if they encountered hostile forces, and the first rule was to make absolutely certain that any hostile aliens knew they had just attacked Earth. The emergency beacon that broadcast their identity was designed by the best engineers on Earth, and it could override almost any computer system in range. Morrison knew the aliens would be terrified once they understood what they had done, because humanity had spent 3,000 years preparing for this moment. Lieutenant Amy Parker ran a scan of the alien fleet and confirmed that all 37 ships had moved to maximum distance and were holding position without making any aggressive moves. She asked Morrison if he thought they would attack again, and Morrison shook his head because he knew the aliens were not pulling back to prepare for another strike. They were pulling back because they were afraid, and they were trying to figure out what to do about a problem they never expected to face. Morrison ordered his chief engineer Dan Hayes to assess the damage and find out if they could make it to a safe port for repairs. Hayes reported through the intercom that the main drive was damaged and life support was running on backup power, but they could limp along for a few more days if they did not push the engines too hard. Morrison stood up from his command chair and walked to the main view screen where he could see the distant shapes of the alien warships holding their position. He knew those ships could destroy the Discovery if they really wanted to, but he also knew they would not try again because the cost would be too high. Earth had not spent 3,000 years locked behind a barrier just to send out a single exploration ship. There were dozens more ships out here mapping the galaxy and establishing contact with peaceful species. More importantly, there were fleets waiting back home with weapons and technology that would make these aliens wish they had never fired that first shot. Morrison was not a warman by nature, but he understood that sometimes the only way to keep peace was to make sure everyone knew the price of breaking it. Amy Parker asked Morrison if they should send a message back to Earth about what happened, and Morrison considered it for a moment before shaking his head. Fleet Command already knew about the attack because the emergency beacon had sent an automatic alert the moment the alien weapons locked onto their ship. Help would come if they needed it, but Morrison hoped it would not come to that. He wanted to give these aliens a chance to do the smart thing and talk instead of fight. Morrison had read the old files about why Earth had been quarantined, and he understood why the ancient council had been afraid of humanity. Humans had a talent for war that was unmatched in their own history, and possibly in the galaxy. But humans also had a talent for building and creating and working together when it mattered most. The captain returned to his chair and opened a channel to the alien fleet because somebody had to make the first move toward peace. He identified himself and his ship and waited to see if the aliens would respond, or if they would make the mistake of attacking again. Morrison hoped they would choose to talk because he was tired of fighting, and he wanted to see if the galaxy had anything worth discovering beyond fear and violence. 3,000 years ago, the Council had looked at humanity and seen only danger. Morrison wanted to show them that they had been wrong. The Coalition fleet held its position at the edge of sensor range and commander. Zekthor found himself in the middle of a crisis that was far beyond his authority to handle. Within minutes of the failed attack on the human ship, his communication systems lit up with incoming calls from officers who ranked far above him. Admiral Hesrak appeared on his main screen, and her scaled face showed the kind of tension that Zekthor had only seen once before during the war with the Craven Swarms. The Admiral demanded an immediate report, and Zekthor gave her every detail about the encounter, including the impossible shields and the single word that had overridden all their systems. Hesrak listened without interrupting, and when Zekthor finished his report, the Admiral closed her eyes for a long moment as if she was gathering strength for what came next. The Admiral ordered Zekthor to hold position and maintain maximum distance from the human vessel while she convened an emergency meeting of the Coalition High Command. Within an hour, Zekthor found himself connected to a virtual conference that included not just military officers, but also members of the Galactic Council itself. Representatives from dozens of species appeared as holographic projections around his bridge, and the fear in the room was thick enough to feel. Nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking, but eventually someone had to speak the truth out loud. The humans had broken free from their quarantine, and the galaxy was not ready for what that meant. A counselor from the outer reaches demanded to know how this was possible because the quantum barrier around Earth was supposed to be unbreakable. The barrier had been designed by the best scientists in the galaxy, and it used technology that bent space and time into a knot that nothing should have been able to pass through. Another counselor suggested that perhaps the humans had not broken through the barrier, but had instead been let out by someone who wanted to cause chaos. That suggestion sparked arguments across the conference as species accused each other of sabotage and betrayal. Admiral Hesrak silenced them all with a sharp command and reminded everyone that accusations without evidence helped nobody. The Admiral began to explain the history that many of the younger officers and counselors did not know or had chosen to forget. 3,000 years ago, the Galactic Council had sent an exploratory mission to a small blue and green planet In a quiet arm of the galaxy, the scouts had discovered a species that was on the verge of achieving space travel, and they had observed these beings called humans for several cycles before reporting back. What the scouts found had terrified the entire council. Humans were still confined to their single planet, and they had not yet developed faster-than-light travel, but they had already created weapons that could destroy their entire world several times over. They had split the atom and turned that knowledge into bombs. They had weaponized diseases that could kill millions. They had even begun to change their own atmosphere in ways that could make their planet uninhabitable. But what scared the council most was not the weapons themselves, but the way humans thought about problems. Where other species saw obstacles that were too difficult to overcome, humans saw challenges that needed clever solutions. They were persistence hunters who had evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, and they applied that same relentless determination to everything they did. The scouts watched humans send primitive machines to other planets in their system. They watched humans cure diseases that should have wiped them out. They watched humans create art and music of stunning beauty, even while they maintained enough military force to turn their homeworld into ash. The lead scout had sent a message back to the council that became famous in certain circles. The message said that humans made war, the way other species made peace, and that if they reached the stars, they would either unite the galaxy or burn it all down. The council had debated for months about what to do with this dangerous species. Some members argued for immediate contact and guidance, while others wanted to destroy Earth before humans could become a threat. In the end, they chose a middle path that they thought was merciful. They would seal Earth behind a quantum barrier and leave the humans alone. If humans destroyed themselves, then the problem was solved. If they survived and thrived, then perhaps in a few thousand years they would have matured enough to join galactic civilization. The barrier went up and the galaxy tried to forget about the caged species on the Little Blue. Planet Admiral Hesrock finished her history lesson and the conference fell silent as everyone absorbed what they had just heard. Zekthor felt a cold weight in his stomach because now he understood exactly what he had attacked. He had fired on a species that the entire galaxy had feared enough to imprison for 3 millennia. A junior officer on his bridge reported that the human vessel was transmitting another signal, and this one was aimed toward the galactic core. The message was encrypted with codes that were far beyond anything the Coalition could break, and nobody knew if the humans were calling for help or simply reporting what had happened. Zekthor made a decision that he hoped would not get him court-martialed. He opened a direct communication channel to the human ship. The channel activated and a human face appeared on the screen. Captain Jake Morrison looked tired, and there was dried blood on his forehead, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Zekthor introduced himself and his position, and then carefully explained that he had acted on standard protocols for unauthorized vessels in restricted space. He admitted that he had not known the identity of the discovery until after his weapons had already fired. Morrison listened without interrupting, and when Zekthor finished, the human captain spoke in a voice that was calm, but carried an edge like a blade hidden in silk. Morrison said that ignorance was not much of an excuse when you nearly killed 40 people, who had done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place. Zekthor had no good response to that because Morrison was right. The human captain asked a question that sent chills down Zekthor's spine. Morrison wanted to know how many ships the Coalition had in the area and whether they were planning to attack again. Zekthor answered honestly that they had 37 vessels and that he had no orders to resume hostilities. Morrison made a sound that might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. The captain said that 37 ships was a good number and asked if Zekthor thought that would be enough. The commander did not understand the question at first, but then Morrison clarified. The human wanted to know if 37 Coalition warships would be enough to stop whatever came next if the Coalition decided to continue their aggression. Thor felt his blood turn to ice because he suddenly understood what Morrison was implying. The Discovery was not alone out here. Earth had not sent a single exploration vessel into the galaxy after 3,000 years of isolation. There were more ships and more humans, and they were spread across multiple systems. Morrison confirmed this with his next words. He told Zekthor that Earth had been very busy during their long quarantine and that they had not wasted 3,000 years sitting idle. Humanity had been watching and learning and preparing for the day when they would break free. The captain said that the Coalition had 2 choices now. They could provide assistance and open peaceful communication, or they could continue hostilities and discover exactly why the ancient council had been so afraid. Admiral Hesserak broke into the channel and identified herself. She apologized directly to Morrison for the attack and offered to provide repair supplies and safe passage to neutral territory. Morrison was quiet for a moment, as if considering whether to accept or reject the offer. Finally, he agreed, but added conditions. The coalition would send repair materials immediately, and they would guarantee safe passage not just for the Discovery, but for any Earth vessel that the coalition encountered. In return, Morrison would report to his superiors that this had been an unfortunate misunderstanding, rather than an act of war. Hesserak agreed to the terms without hesitation, because she knew that war with humanity was not something the galaxy could afford. Admiral Hesserak sat alone, in her private quarters aboard the command ship, and accessed files that had been sealed for thousands of years. She needed to understand what her fleet was truly facing, and the public records did not contain the full story about Earth and its people. The classified archives required special authorization to open, and even admirals rarely looked at documents this old unless there was an emergency. Hesserak entered her command codes and waited as the ancient security systems verified her identity and clearance level. The files appeared on her screen one by one, and she began to read reports that made her question everything she thought she knew about humanity. The first document was a detailed observation log from the original scout team that had discovered Earth. The scouts had spent 2 full cycles watching human civilization from orbit and recording everything they saw. The report described a species that was constantly at war with itself over resources and territory and ideology. Humans fought each other with a creativity and determination that shocked the observers. They built weapons that could level entire cities in seconds. They created diseases in laboratories that could spread across continents. They developed chemicals that could poison the air and water for generations. But the scouts also recorded something that confused them. Despite all this capacity for destruction, humans also showed remarkable cooperation and compassion. They built hospitals to heal the sick and schools to educate their young. They created art and music that moved the soul. They sent aid to enemies who were suffering from natural disasters. The scouts could not reconcile these two sides of humanity, and that contradiction made humans unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. One passage in the report stood out to Hesserak because it described how humans approached problems that seemed impossible to solve. The scouts had watched humans face a deadly disease that was killing millions of their people. Other species might have accepted this as fate or spent decades carefully researching a cure. Humans did neither. They threw every resource they had at the problem and worked day and night until they found not one, but several solutions. The scouts noted that humans seemed to treat obstacles as personal insults that needed to be overcome through sheer force of will. This attitude extended to everything humans did, including warfare. When humans decided to fight, they did not give up until they won, or until they were completely destroyed. There was no middle ground. The next file contained psychological profiles of individual humans that the scouts had studied in detail. Hesserak read about a human female named Margaret, who had survived a terrible war and then dedicated her life to preventing future conflicts. She read about a human male named Chen, who had lost his entire family to disease and then became a doctor to save others. She read about a young human named Alex who had been born in poverty but taught himself advanced mathematics and eventually helped design spacecraft. Each profile showed humans who faced terrible hardships and responded by becoming stronger and more determined. The scouts concluded that humans were persistence, predators on a psychological level, and that they applied this trait to every aspect of their existence. But the file that disturbed Hesserak most was the final report from the lead scout. The scout had written a personal message to the council that went beyond the official observations. He wrote that during his time watching Earth, he had come to respect and fear humans in equal measure. He described watching a human child fall while learning to walk, and then immediately stand up and try again without crying or quitting. He described watching human scientists fail at an experiment hundreds of times and celebrate each failure as a lesson learned. He described watching human soldiers sacrifice themselves to save comrades they barely knew. The scout wrote that humans had a quality that other species lacked, and he called it stubborn hope. Humans believed they could overcome anything if they just kept trying, and that belief made them capable of achievements that should have been impossible. The scout's final words in the report were what haunted Hesserak as she sat in her quarters. He wrote that the council had three choices. They could make contact with humans and try to guide them toward peaceful development. But that was risky because humans might reject guidance or learn things they should not know. They could destroy Earth before humans achieved space travel, but that would be genocide of a species that had not yet done anything wrong. Or they could seal Earth behind a barrier and hope that humans would either destroy themselves or mature during isolation. The scout recommended the third option, but he added a warning that Hesserak now understood was prophetic. He wrote that if the council chose containment, they should not assume the barrier would hold forever. Humans were already planning how to break free even though they did not yet know the barrier existed. That was simply how human minds worked. They saw the stars and they wanted to reach them and nothing would stop them from trying. Hesserak closed the files and sat in silence trying to process what she had learned. The humans were not some mindless destructive force as the legends suggested. They were a complex species capable of both terrible violence and beautiful creation. The question now was which side of humanity would the galaxy see? She thought about Captain Morrison and the way he had handled the situation with the Discovery. He had been angry about the attack, but he had not demanded revenge or made threats he could not back up. Instead, he had negotiated for practical things like repairs and safe passage. That showed restraint and wisdom. But Hesserak also remembered the way Morrison had quietly implied that Earth had more ships and more resources waiting. That was a warning delivered with a smile, and it showed that humans understood how to use fear as a tool without actually using violence. The Admiral activated her communication system and called for another conference with the Galactic Council. This time she wanted to speak not to military commanders but to the civilian leaders who would decide the galaxy's response to humanity's return. The council members appeared on her screen looking tired and worried. Many of them had spent the hours since the incident reading the same files that Hesserak had just finished. They knew what they were dealing with now, and they knew the choice they made in the next few days would shape the future of the entire galaxy. Counselor Vren spoke first, and his crystalline form flickered with agitation. He argued that the council should immediately reinforce the quantum barrier and trap the humans before they could spread further into the galaxy. Other counselors shouted him down, saying that it was already too late for containment. If one human ship had escaped, then others certainly had. Trying to trap them now would only start the war that everyone feared. A counselor named Elder Tom raised one of his many appendages, and the room fell silent out of respect for his age and wisdom. Elder Tom had been alive when the barrier was first created, and he had voted against it at the time. Now he said that the day he had warned about had finally arrived, and the council needed to face it with courage instead of fear. Elder Tom argued that humanity deserved a chance to prove what they had become during their long isolation. He pointed out that the scouts had observed humans 3,000 years ago, when they were still divided and primitive by galactic standards. A lot could change in 3,000 years. His own species had been savage warriors when they first achieved space travel, but they had grown and learned and become peaceful members of the galactic community. Why should humans not have the same opportunity? Several counselors objected, saying that humans were different and more dangerous than any species the galaxy had encountered before. Elder Tom agreed that humans were dangerous, but he argued that danger was not the same as evil. A species could be powerful and still choose peace. The debate continued for hours, and Hesserak listened to every argument from both sides. She understood the fear that drove counselors like Vren to want containment. The galaxy had been at peace for centuries, and nobody wanted to risk that stability. But she also understood Elder Tom's point about giving humans a fair chance. Eventually, the council took a vote on whether to attempt diplomatic contact with Earth or to treat humanity as an immediate threat requiring military response. The vote was closer than Hesserak expected, but ultimately the council decided in favor of opening diplomatic channels. They would send an official delegation to make contact with Earth's government and establish formal relations. Hesserak was chosen to lead the military escort for this diplomatic mission because she had already made contact with Captain Morrison and his crew. She accepted the assignment knowing it might be the most important mission of her career. The fate of billions of beings across hundreds of worlds might depend on how well she handled the first formal meeting between humanity and the galactic community. She sent a message to the Discovery informing Captain Morrison that the council wished to establish peaceful relations and asking if he would be willing to arrange a meeting. Morrison's response came back within the hour, and it was carefully worded but positive. He said that Earth would welcome representatives from the Galactic Council, and that he would forward the request to his superiors. The captain added that he hoped this meeting would be the beginning of a long friendship, rather than the start of humanity's next war. 3 weeks passed between the incident with the Discovery and the arrival of the diplomatic delegation from Earth. During those weeks, the Coalition fleet provided repair materials to Captain Morrison and his crew while maintaining a respectful distance. The repairs took longer than expected, because human technology was different from anything the Coalition engineers had seen before. The Discovery used power systems that should not have worked according to known physics, and its computer systems operated on principles that made no sense to alien technicians. Dan Hayes and his engineering team worked alongside Coalition specialists who were both fascinated and slightly terrified by what they were learning. One Coalition engineer named Zell asked Hayes how humans had developed such advanced technology while sealed behind a barrier. Hayes smiled and explained that having 3,000 years with nothing to do except think and experiment had given humanity plenty of time to get creative. Lieutenant Amy Parker spent her time monitoring communications between the Discovery and the Coalition fleet. She noticed that more and more ships were arriving in the system each day. Some were military vessels, but others appeared to be science ships and civilian transports. Word about the encounter with humans had spread across the galaxy faster than official channels could control. Species from dozens of worlds wanted to see the humans for themselves and verify that the quarantined species had really broken free. Parker reported to Morrison that they were becoming something of a tourist attraction. The captain was not pleased about this, but he understood that curiosity was better than hostility. He ordered his crew to be professional and courteous to any aliens who made contact, but to avoid sharing too much information about Earth's capabilities or locations of other human vessels. Lieutenant Kyle Bennett used the waiting time to study everything he could learn about galactic civilization. The Coalition had provided the Discovery with access to their public databases as a gesture of goodwill. Bennett spent hours reading about the hundreds of species that made up the Galactic Council and the complex political structures that governed their interactions. He learned about ancient wars that had nearly destroyed entire sectors of space. He read about technological achievements that seemed like magic. He discovered that the galaxy was far older and more complicated than anyone on Earth had imagined. But he also noticed something interesting in the historical records. Every major species in the galaxy had gone through a violent phase before achieving peace. The Craven had been hive warriors who consumed entire planets. The Void Collective had been pirates and raiders. Even the peaceful Elders had histories filled with conquest and bloodshed. Humanity was not unique in having a dark past. The diplomatic ship from Earth arrived exactly when they said it would, and the sight of it made every alien in the system stop what they were doing to stare. The vessel was called the Horizon, and it was 3 times larger than the Discovery. Its hull was smooth and dark like polished stone, and it moved through space with a grace that defied its massive size. Unlike the Discovery, which had been damaged and limping, the Horizon radiated pow. The chamber erupted with noise the moment the vote was announced. Some counselors celebrated while others sat in stunned silence. Counselor Vren and his supporters left the chamber without speaking to anyone, and their anger was visible in every movement. But the majority of the council seemed relieved that a decision had finally been made. Elder Tom approached Ambassador Grant and extended one of his appendages in the gesture his species used for formal agreements. Grant accepted the gesture and thanked him for his support. The old counselor said that he hoped humanity would prove worthy of the trust being placed in them. Grant promised that Earth would not waste this opportunity. Admiral Hesserak watched the celebrations from her position near the back of the chamber. She felt a complex mixture of emotions that she could not quite name. Part of her was relieved that war had been avoided. Part of her was nervous about what would happen next. And part of her was curious about what humanity would do now that they had freedom to move throughout the galaxy. She caught Captain Morrison's eye across the room, and he nodded to her with something that looked like respect. Morrison understood that Hesserak could have handled the incident with the Discovery very differently. She could have sent more ships to destroy them. She could have refused to negotiate. Instead, she had chosen to listen and learn. That choice had made all the difference. The diplomatic celebrations continued for several hours, but eventually, the formal proceedings came to an end. Ambassador Grant and her delegation returned to the Horizon, while the council members departed to inform their home governments about the historic decision. Captain Morrison and the crew of the Discovery prepared to finally continue their original mission of exploration. Dan Hayes reported that all repairs were complete and the ship was ready to travel. Amy Parker had already plotted a course to the next system on their survey list. Kyle Bennett was eager to see more of the galaxy, now that they did not have to worry about being attacked for existing. Morrison gave the order to depart and the Discovery left the system with its crew, feeling optimistic about the future for the first time in weeks. Ambassador Grant sat in her private office, aboard the Horizon, and composed a detailed report for the government back on Earth. She described every moment of the negotiations and included her assessment of the various council members they had met. Her report was honest about both the opportunities and the dangers that lay ahead. Humanity had been granted provisional membership, but that status could be revoked if they made serious mistakes. The galaxy was watching Earth closely and judging every action humans took. Grant wrote that humanity needed to be patient and thoughtful during this probationary period. They needed to show the galaxy that humans could be trusted as neighbors and allies. She recommended sending more diplomatic missions to establish relationships with individual species rather than just dealing with the Council as a whole. 6 months passed and humanity began to establish itself as a presence in galactic civilization. More ships left Earth and spread throughout the galaxy carrying explorers and scientists and traders. Human colonies were established on planets that had been surveyed and approved by the Council. Trade agreements were signed with species who were curious about human goods and technology. Cultural exchanges brought human art and music to alien worlds, while Earth welcomed performers and artists from across the galaxy. Not everything went smoothly, and there were incidents where humans clashed with other species over misunderstandings or cultural differences. But these conflicts were resolved through diplomacy, rather than violence, and slowly the galaxy began to relax around humanity. Captain Morrison and the crew of the Discovery became minor celebrities throughout human space. Their encounter with the Coalition fleet had been the spark that started everything. Whenever Morrison visited a new human colony or outpost, people wanted to hear the story of how he had faced down an alien battle fleet and lived to tell about it. Morrison always downplayed his role and emphasized that the real heroes were the diplomats like Ambassador Grant, who had done the hard work of building relationships. But privately, he was proud of what his crew had accomplished. They had been the first humans to meet aliens in combat, and they had chosen to offer peace instead of revenge. Admiral Hesrak also found her life changed by the events surrounding first contact with humanity. The Coalition promoted her to Supreme Admiral and gave her responsibility for coordinating military relationships with Earth. She worked closely with human military officers to establish protocols for joint operations and emergency responses. Hesrak was surprised to discover that she actually liked many of the humans she worked with. They were professional and competent, and they shared her commitment to preventing war rather than starting it. She developed a particular friendship with a human admiral named Scott Price, who commanded one of Earth's frontier fleets. Price had a sense of humor that Hesrak found refreshing, and he never tried to intimidate or impress her. He simply did his job well and expected others to do the same. 2 years after humanity joined the Galactic Council, a crisis erupted that tested the new alliance. A previously unknown species from beyond the galactic rim launched attacks on several Council worlds. These raiders used technology that was different from anything the galaxy had seen before, and they showed no interest in communication or negotiation. They simply attacked and destroyed and moved on to the next target. The Council mobilized its defense forces, but the raiders were difficult to track and even harder to fight. Traditional tactics did not work against an enemy who refused to follow any predictable patterns. After several devastating attacks, counselors began to panic and argue about what to do. Ambassador Grant attended an emergency session of the Council and listened to the debate with growing frustration. She finally requested permission to speak, and the chamber fell silent. Grant said that humanity had experienced fighting unconventional enemies who did not follow normal rules of engagement. Earth's long history of warfare had taught humans how to adapt quickly to new threats. She offered to have human military forces join the Coalition response if the Council would accept their help. Some counselors objected, immediately saying that giving humans a role in military operations was too dangerous. But Elder Tom supported Grant's offer and argued that this was exactly the kind of situation where humanity's unique skills could be valuable. The Council, voted to accept Earth's assistance, and human ships began arriving in the affected sectors within days. Admiral Price took command of a combined fleet that included both human and coalition vessels. Captain Morrison and the Discovery were assigned to a reconnaissance group tasked with tracking the raiders. The human forces brought new tactics and strategies that surprised both their allies and their enemies. Morrison's group used unconventional scanning methods to find raider bases that had been hidden from coalition sensors. Human combat ships engaged the raiders with aggressive maneuvers that caught the enemy off guard. Most importantly, human commanders showed a flexibility and creativity in battle that allowed them to respond to situations as they developed, rather than following rigid plans. The campaign against the raiders lasted 3 months and ended with the destruction of their main fleet and the capture of several key leaders. The victory was achieved through cooperation between human and coalition forces working together. Admiral Hesserack personally thanked Admiral Price for his leadership during the crisis. Price replied that the coalition forces had been equally essential to the victory and that neither side could have won alone. The successful joint operation did more to build trust between humanity and the galaxy than years of diplomacy could have accomplished. Species that had been skeptical about accepting humans now saw them as valuable allies. Even Councillor Vren grudgingly admitted that humanity had proven useful. When the Galactic Council met to review Earth's provisional membership status, the vote was almost unanimous in favor of granting full membership. Only 3 councillors voted against, and Vren was not one of them. Ambassador Grant accepted full membership on behalf of humanity and gave a speech that emphasized Earth's commitment to peaceful coexistence and mutual cooperation. She acknowledged that humans were not perfect and that there would be challenges ahead, but she expressed confidence that humanity and the galaxy could build a future together that was better than what either could achieve alone. Captain Morrison attended the ceremony as a guest of honor. He stood beside Amy Parker and Kyle Bennett and Dan Hayes, watching as Ambassador Grant signed the formal documents that made Earth a full member of the galactic community. Morrison thought about the day his ship had been attacked by Zekthor's fleet and how close they had come to disaster. If he had responded with violence instead of restraint, the galaxy might now be engaged in a devastating war. If Admiral Hesserack had not been willing to listen, humanity might still be isolated and imprisoned. If the Council had not found the courage to give humans a chance, none of this would have been possible. The word Earth no longer made aliens nervous when they heard it. Instead, it had become associated with reliability and strength, and the willingness to help others. Humanity had proven that a species could have a violent past and still choose peace. They had shown that being dangerous and being good were not opposites. The galaxy had learned that humans made excellent friends and terrible enemies, and that the choice of which one you faced was entirely up to you. 3,000 years of isolation had not destroyed humanity or made them weak. Instead, it had given them time to grow and mature, and become ready for the responsibilities that came with joining a community of worlds. The cage had become a chrysalis, and what emerged was a species that understood both the cost of war and the value of peace, and confidence. Admiral Hesserack watched it approach on her sensors and felt a mixture of awe and concern. If this was what human diplomatic ships looked like, she did not want to see their warships. The horizon was accompanied by an escort of 6 smaller vessels that maintained perfect formation around the larger ship. Those escort ships were clearly military craft, and they carried enough weapons to make any aggressor think twice. The Horizon hailed the coalition fleet and requested permission to dock with the command station that had been set up in the system. A human voice came through the communication channel, clear and professional. The speaker identified herself as Ambassador Lisa Grant and said that she was authorized to speak on behalf of Earth's unified government. Hesserack granted permission for docking and began preparing for what might be the most important meeting of her life. She chose her words carefully when she welcomed the human delegation because she knew that any mistake could undo weeks of careful diplomacy. Grant responded with equal formality and thanked the Admiral for the hospitality shown to Captain Morrison and his crew. The meeting took place in a large conference chamber that had been designed to accommodate multiple species with different environmental needs. Ambassador Grant entered the room with a small group of advisors, and Captain Morrison was among them. The human delegation looked around the chamber with expressions of curiosity and caution. Grant was a woman who appeared to be in her middle years with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in difficult negotiations. Morrison stood slightly behind her and to her right in a position that showed respect without submission. The captain had cleaned up since his ordeal and wore a formal uniform. That looked impressive even by galactic standards. HFY greeted the humans formally and introduced the other members of the council who were present either in person or through holographic projection. Counselor Vren was there representing the voices who still feared humanity. Elder Tom attended as the senior member who supported diplomatic contact. A dozen other counselors watched from their distant worlds. Grant acknowledged each introduction with a slight bow that seemed respectful without being submissive. When the formalities were complete, the ambassador addressed the assembled council with words she had clearly prepared carefully. Grant began by acknowledging that humanity knew about the quarantine and the reasons behind it. She said that Earth had discovered the quantum barrier centuries ago, when their scientists were experimenting with faster-than-light travel. At first, humans had been angry about being imprisoned without trial or explanation. They had felt betrayed by a galactic community that judged them without ever speaking to them directly. But over time, that anger had transformed into determination. Humans decided that if the galaxy thought they were too dangerous to meet, then humanity would prove them wrong by becoming better. Grant explained that Earth had spent the last 1,000 years working toward planetary unity and peace. The old nations and conflicts that the ancient scouts had observed were gone now. Humanity had learned to cooperate on a scale that their ancestors would have thought impossible. Counselor Vren interrupted to point out that humans still maintained large military forces. His crystalline form flashed with colors that indicated skepticism. He asked why a peaceful species needed weapons capable of destroying planets. Grant did not hesitate with her answer. She said that humans had learned a difficult lesson from their history. Peace was not achieved by being weak or helpless. Peace came from having the strength to protect yourself and the wisdom to use that strength only when necessary. Every species in the council chamber had weapons and armies. The difference was that humanity was honest about what those weapons meant. Humans did not pretend to be harmless. They acknowledged their capacity for violence while committing themselves to peaceful coexistence whenever possible. Elder Tom spoke up and asked what humanity wanted from the galactic community. Grant's answer was straightforward. Earth wanted recognition as an independent sovereign power with the right to explore space and establish colonies. Humans wanted access to galactic trade networks and the ability to exchange knowledge and culture with other species. Most importantly, humanity wanted assurance that no species would ever be judged and imprisoned the way Earth had been. Grant argued that the quarantine had been unjust because it punished humans for potential crimes they had not committed. She said that if the Galactic Council believed in justice and fairness, then they needed to admit that what was done to Earth was wrong. The chamber erupted into debate after Grant finished speaking. Some counselors argued that the quarantine had been necessary to protect the galaxy. Others insisted that humanity deserved an apology. The argument went back and forth for hours while the human delegation sat quietly and listened. Ambassador Grant did not interrupt or try to control the conversation. She simply waited for the council to work through their disagreements. Morrison watched the aliens argue and realized that this was not so different from diplomatic meetings on Earth. Different species with different interests trying to find common ground. Eventually, Admiral HFY called for order and suggested that the council take a formal vote on humanity's petition for recognition. The vote took longer than expected because many counselors wanted to consult with their home governments before making such an important decision. HFY declared a recess and the council agreed to reconvene in 2 days. During the break, Ambassador Grant and her team stayed aboard the Horizon and held private meetings with individual counselors who wanted to learn more about Earth. Captain Morrison gave tours of the Discovery to scientists and journalists who wanted to see human technology up close. Kyle Bennett found himself answering endless questions about Earth's history and culture. Amy Parker shared music and art from Earth with aliens who were surprised by the beauty humans could create. Dan Hayes discussed engineering principles with coalition technicians who were eager to understand how human ships worked. When the council reconvened 2 days later, the atmosphere in the chamber had changed. The counselors who had been most afraid of humanity seemed less certain in their opposition. Elder Tom proposed a compromise that surprised everyone. He suggested that humanity be granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council, with full membership to be reviewed after a probationary period. During this time, humans would have access to trade and travel, but would be subject to observation and evaluation. If humanity proved they could coexist peacefully, then full membership would follow. Councillor Vran objected, but he was outvoted by a significant margin. The final vote was 62 in favor and 23 against, with 15 abstentions. Humanity had won its place among the stars through patience and diplomacy, rather than force.